Do you want to tell any more Nick's stories? You know what I mean? Because I kind of want to get into that. I'm not.
Well, he looks a lot like Smokey Robinson. If you've ever seen Smokey Robinson, the green-eyed, biracial, he's very handsome man. Typical gear of the era. He had Jordache jeans on all the time, and his shirt was always open, so you could see hair on his chest. And the women just adored him. But I will say this: he was an extremely violent pimp. Very violent. I mean, he had a very violent relationship with Sharon. There was a night that I remember I found her unconscious in the parking lot that he had just beaten the crap out of her. And I had to take her to the ER and, that whole fiasco. And then he started coming after me because I took her to the hospital. That was another time that Ruck stepped in between us. I think Nick would have hurt me that night if Ruck hadn't stepped in between us, literally, and literally told me, get the fuck out of here, and I ran the hell out, because, Nick he ran at me. I think he was going to hurt me, and I'd see this with Nick, the women that he would just beat the crap out of, put them in the hospital, break their bones, and they'd go back. Back then, a high-class hooker was $100 an hour hooker in 79. That was a lot of money, and you could easily, and the average that Tina was making when I met her was $10,000 a week.
Oh my
God.
God.
You figure that the average girl is making $10,000 a week back in 1979, and each pimp has an average of 5 women. So he's got $50,000 a week just in women alone coming through the door, not counting drug sales.
Yeah, oh my God. Did you start, when new girls came in, did you kind of give them, a pep talk, or did you guys kind of stay separate? You know what I mean? Was there a girl club there,
No, because I learned you could go up and warn these women, and they're not listening to you. They're so enamored by the whole club thing. The Rolls Royce in the front, and the club, and they're the owners, and they know the Jacksons, and they've got money, and and they got drugs. These girls are not going to listen to you, period.
Gotcha,
So I learned I could say anything to them, and this was going to fall on deaf ears. When they first started having the parties at the house, I'd see the marijuana and the alcohol, okay? And then I'd see a couple of lines of coke. That really wasn't very serious, but when freebasing hit, and when freebasing first started, okay, freebasing was considered very high level, high class, because it was very expensive. You had to get large quantities of it. You had to know how to use it. And so it was something that only really very wealthy people did. And then as it started moving its way down into the masses, and then it got to the point where there was every motherfucking John was high on coke, which means he couldn't get his dick hard. So you're sitting there with a guy who can't get his dick hard, but he wants to get off. That's a trip in itself, right?
Yeah.
And then they get these weird, bizarre ideas when they're on coke. Let me stick this up your ass. Oh my God, has everybody lost their mind? But that's what it does. And then all of a sudden when coke rips through and everybody's on coke and they're all fucking crazy, but it did something to change the business itself, because the business didn't used to be so linked to porn. It got linked to porn on the coke because they couldn't have normal sex on the coke. That's how they got somehow tied together. I don't know how to explain it, because you never used to see. But when coke hit, you got this huge porn collection and these crazy ideas, and it all seemed linked together.
That's interesting.
It kind of went from sex. If you ask me, it went from sex to fantasy, and that's when the business changed.
And that's, I guess 79, 80. You're still right around there, kind of?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. And then it got to the point where a lot of the old-timers like me, who just wanted, say, a normal transaction, couldn't find it. All the clients were on drugs and some kind of weird craziness. So you found that the women that were coming into the business were different. Because some women can tolerate it, some couldn't. In other words, what you found was that the women would be on the drugs, okay? So then you've got this whole wave of women coming in, and all of a sudden have got this drug problem that the older generation didn't have.
I mean, do you start seeing different people because of the drugs? Do you start seeing more people come in, or less people come in, more high-end people? You know?
Yeah,
what I mean?
because like the first business meeting we had was about the fact that the demand for cocaine was really strong, and they've been supplying little grams here and there, kind of a thing, but it was getting really strong. There was really more of a demand coming in, and they were wanting to know, like, we had a business meeting of how are we going to handle this? Do we want to deal drugs in the club and jeopardize the club and keep it off the street? Do we want to do it at the house? How are we going to do this, right? Do we have the girls carry it, but then the girls are likely to get knocked off for the drugs? I mean, if she's carrying, a kilo of cocaine on her, somebody's going to kill her. So, I mean, we had to have a discussion about how are we going to, deal with this, because at the same time, because the Johns are starting to ask for coke with every trick now. So the girls are, but it's not enough that she's bringing a gram or two on the call. They're wanting to do ounces and stuff. I mean, what do we do about that,
80s.
right? So, I mean, yeah, the call, we're debating, like, well, what do we do to meet the demand for this without getting somebody killed? Now, we're keeping most of the drugs in the office, but the way we set it up was that Rock was going to be doing basically a drive-thru business. So if anybody needed anything, they could come drive through, because there was like this little U driveway in front of the club. They could just come up, talk to Rock, and then go on out, and that way, because there wasn't any parking anyway, you know what I mean? They could just do like a drive-thru. That way we don't have to worry about affecting the club, but we can still protect it, but keep it outside the club at the same time. Yeah,
good play. I like it. So
this is what we set up, is basically we have the drive-through business, and then when he needed more of the drugs, I could pull it out of the office and give it to him. I remember I bought this like fake Pepsi can, where we'd put more drugs in the Pepsi can, and I'd give it to him, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So, that's when I remember a couple times Michael Jackson had pulled up, and I'd see him open the car door, so I know it was him in the car.
What kind of car? Is this like a limo? Like, what the fuck, Michael
limo.
Jackson?
Yeah, it was a limo. And then the brothers, I remember Tito and Jermaine came into the club a lot, because they also liked the girls. So they were up at the house sometimes. I know they liked Donna. Yeah. I mean, Jermaine went out on a couple of dates with Donna.
Really? Donna went out with one of the Jacksons? Wow.
Yep. We became friends again. She got tired of living alone. So we started being friends again. And then, plus, she started doing coke, and she started getting her coke from the club. So, of course, she's starting to talk to Rock again, because she's getting her coke from Rock. And so we just started gravitating, being friends again. And then, of course, Rock was trying to talk her into doing some stuff. Like, I can set you up some private parties. You'll be, yeah. So, I mean, Donna, I think, ran away from us before she could get sucked into it. Yeah. So we had a brief sort of reconciliation of our friendship.
And she got some Jacksons. I mean, it had to be a bustling clubs. You got these big names playing there. You got limos driving through. You got, call girls coke drive through. I mean, the place has got to be
a lot of them.
Blown up.
I know there was one, McNichols. That was another one. The McNichols boy was big back then.
Okay.
And he would come through there a lot, and he had a big thing for Donna too.
Damn, Donna.
Yeah.
Donna pulls them.
She was the one. God bless her. I love the fact that she never let anything bother her.
I got you.
I mean,
yeah, it's
So what had happened one night was I turned down this one call. Didn't like the guy's voice, and then what happened is he called the next number, got one of the women in the family, and she had asked me about it, and I said no, I didn't like him. Well, evidently the pimp got on her saying, Jody's too picky, you just need to go, we got bills to pay, blah, 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 and sent her out on the call anyway. Okay?
Yeah.
Midnight, he's calling me saying, has she come to you? Do you know where she's at? She hasn't come home. And I said, you didn't send her on that call, did you? And he's yeah. I'm like, oh, shit. I said, there's a reason why I turn these guys down, And, I told him, I said, there was something wrong with that guy's voice,
Yeah.
And he goes, well, what do we do now? And I mean, I tried calling the cops, saying, and they were like, not wanting to hear it, They were laughing, Like, we're supposed to go chasing out after hookers? Are you kidding? I mean, so I got this whole attitude like she gets what she gets from the cops. That stuck with me. Like, no, I'm telling you, there's a woman that's missing. The guy is dangerous. She hasn't come home. This is a mother. She's got 2 small children. And the cops were just literally laughing and blowing me off. That affected me. So I tell her man, you know, her husband, I said, look, I said, I've got the address. You know, I know where it's at. I mean, let me go over there and see if I can see what's going on. Because, again, I've done this before. In my mind, I've gone in on some very difficult calls, and I've gotten women out because I do know NLP, and I do know how to get women out of a tough situation by talking, right?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking it's going to be something like that, you know? Only when I get there, I found her chained to a refrigerator, and she had been stabbed 51 times. So I got her unchained, got her in the car, blood is spewing everywhere. I get her to the local, you know, ER. Now, you got to remember, this is when AIDS was raging. And when AIDS first came out, it was a lot like COVID. It reminds me of COVID because they didn't really know how it was being transmitted, and everybody was terrified of it, right? And if you were a prostitute, a gay, or an IV drug user, you had the plague, and nobody wanted near you. So here I come dragging into ER with her, right? And the ER people wouldn't touch her. She's literally spewing blood from all these stab wounds.
Is she alive?
And,
I mean, what is she?
Yeah. Well, what happened was, again, somewhat of my legal background and the way that I just am, I said, if I move her from here because you guys refuse to, I said, we will file a wrongful death case against this hospital. So I suggest you start sewing her up now. And they, oh, okay. And I mean, they said, well, we'll sew her up, but we're not admitting her. I'm like, I don't give a fuck whether you admit her or not. Sew her up. I mean, because she's still spewing blood all over the place, right?
My Lord.
Because she was perceived as a prostitute. They were going to just, stand there and let her bleed to death? You know? I mean, that bothered me. So we get her stitched up. And there was a task force at that time that had been assigned to catch the Hillside Strangler. Okay? So, I mean, as far as I can... This was literally the body shop. I pulled her out of the body shop of these guys. The 2 cousins, okay?
Oh, so this is related to them.
Yeah. These guys had been known pimps before. I mean, there was a lot. We had real good, solid reason to believe that this was the Hillside Strangler. And especially now I pull her out of this place, and she's just been tortured like this. And so I'm taking her to the task force. She's an eyewitness to what they just did to her.
Yeah.
Okay? And it really deeply affected me when the guy that met with us, because, I mean, at that time, again, we didn't have the internet or cell phones. You had to go down and talk to people. So we go down, we show him the wounds that she had just been tacked. I explained to him what happened, and he just stares at me. And I'm like, well, aren't you going to do something, like get a search warrant, something? He said, you expect me to get a search warrant on the word of a whore? Whoa! I was like, excuse me? Because he said, you got to understand something. I can't get a search warrant on the word of a whore. I go, why? Why not? You know? I mean, because in my mind, we're the most attacked person there is, right?
Yeah.
And he said, well, for one thing, your testimony's not reliable. Why? He said, well, was she on drugs? Was she high? I said, well, I think her wounds prove it's really irrelevant, don't you? You know? And
good point.
then he goes, that's not it. He said, you have to understand, in the eyes of the law, she is a criminal. And I'm like, that just, I didn't grasp what he meant by that. I go, what has that got to do with jack shit? This woman has just been stabbed 51 times. She was held hostage, chained to a refrigerator. What does it matter whether she's a criminal or not? You know? And he tells me, under the law, he said, look at it this way. He said, if there was a drug deal that went down and the drug dealer got ripped off, would we step in and intervene in that situation? I go, so because she's conducting an illegal transaction, it's game on, whatever goes? Is that what you're telling me? You know? And he goes, under the law, we can't be protecting someone while they're committing a crime. And I said, okay, so let me get this straight. if someone is a prostitute, engaging in the act of prostitution because it's illegal, and someone kills them, you're telling me it's fair game because she was engaged in a criminal act? Is that what you're telling me? I was just like blown away by what he was telling me.
That's
you know?
unbelievable.
I said, then there's a problem with the law. That's where I got even more upset, is because the Hillside Stranglers were holding women hostage and forcing them into prostitution. And women that had not been prostitutes prior. So that once they were labeled as prostitutes, they were written off by the system. And that's where I started butting heads initially with LAPD. I'm like, wait a minute, these women were not prostitutes to start with. They made them prostitutes so that you would not help them. So don't you think there's something fucked up about that? You know, that they know this, that the predators know this, that this is like the loophole, right? Because I'm like, okay, well, how do you classify someone as a prostitute? Is it a prostitution record? No, if you're just identified as a prostitute. Well, how do you identify as a prostitute? Just some guy looks at you and says, that's a whore, that's it, that's over, you're identified as a criminal, and then you lose all your rights, is that it? I found out that if you are raped, that they will not give you victim services if you're a prostitute. Domestic violence shelters will not admit you if you're a prostitute. I mean, it just might, if anybody needed a domestic violence shelter in my mind, it would be a prostitute. So I was discovering that there were teen runaways like Tony, who the reason that they were falling into the hands of somebody like Larry is that they couldn't go to the typical teen runaway shelters. They would be turned away once they were identified as a prostitute. And I'm like, it was like a whole rabbit hole I started going down, finding out that you were labeled as a prostitute. I mean, you just were as good as dead. They didn't care. And that just really just so blew my mind that became a lot of my crusade that we've got to change this.
Yeah.
He made her go. And then that happened to her. And then to hear the police talk about her like that, on top of it, that just, I mean, he said it really just, it changed my whole viewpoint about things. You know, Rocket even started getting involved in drug deals that were so scary to me that I put him out of the house. I said, I can't risk this. I said, somebody's going to come in here one night, and I don't know if you've heard the story, but there was a story that went out about some drug dealer that was involved with discos where he killed somebody and hacked him up and stuffed him behind the couch or something. And I started getting really worried that somebody was going to break in the house and kill us to get at the drugs. Because Rock was carrying a lot of drugs at one point, by this point. And I'd said to him, look, love you, all that, but I'm really worried somebody's going to break in here and whack us all at night for drugs, so I need you to get out of the house. I don't want people to know I have drugs here. I don't want to worry about, being broken into. I need you to leave. And he understood. It wasn't him. It was just my fear that, and this is happening. People were breaking in and killing people for drugs, right?
Definitely, yeah.
So it was so weird that night because he says, can I stay here? And I'm like, do you have anything on you? He goes, no. And I said, okay, why? And he said, Nick had just killed himself. And he didn't want to be at the house. And I'm like, what happened? And he told me that Nick had been on a 3-day bender, and it evidently just had enough. Came out of his room, sat down on the curb in front of the house, and blew his brains out.
Jesus,
and I said, what time was this?
With a handgun?
And he said, yeah, with a handgun. He said about an hour ago, and I said, oh my God, could I go ahead and go in and get some sleep? I mean, I could tell he was probably pretty upset by the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And then I waited till the authorities did whatever they had to do. I waited about 2 or 3 days, and then went up and had a talk with Weldon. I said, this is enough. I need to get away from this family. I said, somebody's going to get whacked. I don't want to be in the middle of this. Somebody's going to shoot me. I just need to get away from this. I didn't sign up for this. And he said, you know what? He said, you're absolutely right. He said, things are out of control. He said, I think you're right. He said, I think it's time we get out of Dodge too. He worked out a deal. He said, I need about $160,000 to set up my new life. You need to move Rock back in so he can make sure that you're not like going to the authorities or anything, And he said, you make payments to me until you reach $160,000, and then you're out. You're done. That's the end of it.
That's fair.
Okay, no problem. Shook hands, and that was the end of the deal. But I asked Weldon, I said, why are you doing this? He said, you're the only person that came to me like a man and asked me. Okay.
I love this guy.
He said I gave him the respect of asking him, so he worked out a deal with me.
Yeah, it's fair. And did the club close soon after that? Is it...
Yeah, he closed the club down. Everything closed down. House closed up. Club closed down. Everything closed up. Weldon and them all went back to Texas. It was like death of old school. I mean, they were realizing drugs had taken over this. And people were, you have to understand how crazy people were back then. It just was, I don't even know how to explain it. It was like rampant psychosis had entered people back in the 80s.
It's just so interesting that it all kind of just folded up, and that's it. That little time, again, you're in this window of that little time period. It's so interesting.
You hear a lot of old gangsters, a lot of old pimps talk about how the old days are gone, the game's changed, and that's exactly what hit. Is that when the drugs really took in the 80s, the business became so crazy and really not a business anymore. I was telling my mom I was working in a restaurant, and of course Mom suspected I was lying.
Yeah.
But she couldn't prove it. And it wasn't until right about the time that Rock left that she found out the truth. When I was expecting a client, and I was I remember I was really dolled up. I mean, I had my hair done. In the 80s, you had the big hair, right? And yeah, I was really, the makeup was very extreme in the 80s. So yeah, I was really dolled up. So she comes over unannounced, and she had a key to my apartment. She walks in, and she just takes one look at me and knew. She just knew. I mean, I did not dress like that normally. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and then she heard my phone, because my phone would ring like every 2 seconds. I'm not kidding. Every 2 seconds, ring, 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 ring. I mean, that's, the demand for sex is huge. So the phone just rings constantly. She's hearing the phone ring, ring, ring. She's seen me. She just knows. She goes, I knew it. She goes, I knew it, And I'm like, okay, whatever, Mom. We obviously need to have a talk,
Yeah, definitely.
And then I expected Mom to have a problem with it, and instead she didn't. And that got weird. And I did think she would try to. I thought there'd be you can't do this. She talked me out of it. No, instead she was very intrigued. And her logic was, if she shut me out, then she wouldn't be able to protect me. And that she felt like if she at least, knew what I was doing, then she might be able to help.